Well, there's no such thing as a completely 100% effective missile defense system. The missile will always get through a few missiles in the same way that a bomb would always get through in the Second World War. I see it as more sort of messaging to the Americans, because in May, the Americans released the fact that they were going to go towards the new Golden Dome missile shield against ballistic missile threats and nuclear threats. So I see it as much as messaging to the Americans that probably they would like to come to an accommodation with the Americans on this. And indeed, in terms of what the Americans said in terms of releasing their aspiration for Golden Shield, the Chinese said at the time that they gravely opposed it and it concerned them. Because of the need to militarize space. If you're going to do an anti-ballistic missile defense successfully, you need to use space power. Now, these days, we talk about 5 domains of war, of which cyber and space have been added to the traditional land, sea, and air. And indeed, the Chinese have been militarizing their own sort of space command. And in 2007, for example, they conducted the first anti-satellite test, ASAT as we call it, knocking down an obsolete Chinese weather satellite, with the idea of blinding by hard kill, if they needed to, American assets, because America is undoubtedly the predominant space superpower with the number of satellites it has. But you can also kill things in a soft kill by blinding them, or by spoofing them, or other sort of techniques. So I think it was messaging as well, and it might ultimately lead to some sort of move towards some sort of arms control. In terms of the framework of the battlefield, we have the close battle, the deep battle, and the rear battle. And anti-ballistic missile defense on mainland China is absolutely deep battle stuff to stop the interference from a long way away. That is different than the close battle, which is getting across that piece of water in the Taiwan Strait, and then getting ashore and engaging to knock over the polity and potentially the military of Taiwan. That itself is a significant undertaking. Amphibious operations are the most complex operations in the world, and there are a number of precursor operations that you would need to partake in before you even got ashore, of which you would need to win the control of the air battle. You need to absolutely win control of the sea, both surface and subsurface. You would need to win the anti-mine battle so that Taiwan wouldn't be capable of sea denial. All those things are incredibly complex. That doesn't mean China wouldn't be in a position to do it. We often talk about a thing called the Davidson window, which comes from Admiral Davidson, a former commander of US PACOM, Pacific Command, now called US Indo-PACOM, which posits that by 2027, China would have the military capability to mount an invasion. But there are so many variables within that in terms of the political support and military support that Taiwan might have, not just from America, or not from America, but also from Japan. Because, for example, from a Japanese perspective, they see themselves increasingly, particularly after the meeting, the September military parade, as being surrounded themselves by an authoritarian axis of Chinese, Russia, North Korea, and breaking Taiwan, for example, would be the first part of the island chain being broken from a Japanese perspective. Well, we talk about I and W, indicators and warnings. So what China will seek to do is to normalize their large-scale activity to try and deceive about their future intentions. You really win any type of war if you want to win it quickly, which they do, by 4 things: control of the air, shock, surprise, and offensive recce. The interesting one about offensive recce, if you're trying to deceive, is that the massive Chinese fishing fleet is seen as a sort of third arm of the People's Liberation Navy. And it could be that that becomes the platform for a massive drone strikes, for example. So that would fulfill the function of both reconnaissance and strike without necessarily being detected. You would detect a large number of vessels, but it's always difficult to understand intent unless you've got great signals intelligence or great human intelligence, Well, we always talk about two things. We either talk about training for war, uh, generic training, or we talk about training for the war that you actually want to fight. Now, we do know that in political terms, there is a one China policy, of which Taiwan is the state which China wants to make itself whole. And therefore, from a purely military perspective, it makes absolute sense if that is on your agenda to take over Taiwan either by military means or by other indirect means. The greatest strategy, of course, is to win without fighting. And part of the Chinese approach is to try and manipulate the public mind and political mind of Taiwan to try and knock that over so they don't have to invade. So training for the war makes sense in the same way, for example, that the British Army also did this. So a village in the middle of Salisbury Plain, an urban village 50 years ago, would have mimicked a German village for the Russian attacks of the Third Shock Army. Then it transformed into an Iraqi village, and then later on into looking like a Afghan village. So it makes sense to train for the war if that is the war which your foreign policy is based upon. So you shouldn't read too much into that, apart from the fact that it just shows that absolute focus and unity of purpose from the Chinese on what they seek to achieve in the future. That doesn't mean that war is inevitable. I always quote A.G.P. Taylor, the historian of my youth, that nothing is inevitable until it happens. There's always a trade-off between the sword and the shield, and therefore currently between the defense of the ship and anti-ship missiles, and which is the is in the predominant space at the moment. Now, we really don't know in the last 40 years where that sits. And recently we've seen this sort of notion that surface ships are vulnerable due to missile technology, and maybe the offense is greater than the defense at the moment. Now, we don't really know that. The joke going around after the strike on the Moskva during the Ukrainian-Russian war is that in the future, there's only two types of ships. The first is targets, and the second is submarines. I mean, there's some truth to that in terms of that is the thing that we're all looking to see in a future war. Are anti-ship missiles the thing which is going to sort of literally sink surface fleets in the way that we do business, and therefore will navies move to a drone-like surface fleet? And indeed, we are seeing a unmanned surface fleets being built to some extent by the Chinese. The other aspect from HMS Richmond is part of the reason that American and British forces conduct the operations where they do from the off the Chinese coast is because of freedom of navigation operations. Again, because of the Chinese island building around the Paracels and Spratlys, they are trying to redefine the maritime geography of that. What the HMS Richmond and other ships are doing when they go through those areas is asserting the right to transit passage, and therefore not recognizing any claims that the Chinese might have in political or economic terms to that being their part of their seascape. Final part of this, of course, is you can intelligence gather by having simulated strikes to see what the response of the radars of the defensive assets would be. And again, this can be useful in intelligence terms in tweaking your weapon systems. It's the thing we call a measurement of operational effectiveness, which we see going on quite a lot after large-scale missile strikes in Ukraine and Russia, for example. Yeah, it could become a new sphere of war. I mean, what the Chinese are really signaling, I think, is that we need an accommodationist policy to accommodate their desire for a one nation China with Taiwan as part of its not just its sphere of influence, but part of China. Now, again, you then come on to the real question: is does China then perceive itself as a revanchist sort of imperial power in the way that most people in the West would see Russia at the moment? That is where you get into the larger geopolitical concern from Malaysia and Philippines, Japan, and America about the notion of not only breaking the first island chain, but breaking the second island chain, and therefore China's sphere of influence extending really to the mid of the Pacific and down through all the area, down through the Philippines, Malaysia, and beyond.